The notification on my phone lit up the dark hallway just as I was sliding my second earring in. I had 10 minutes before I needed to leave for my uncle's house. The drive from my apartment in Denver to his place in Cherry Hills Village was exactly 32 minutes without traffic, and tonight there wouldn't be any. It was a Tuesday in February. The roads would be empty and gray and salted. I was ready. I had even ironed the blouse my father used to say made me look like a serious woman. I grabbed my keys off the hook by the door, and that's when my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It was Marcus Webb, my father's CPA for 19 years, and mine for the 2 years since my father passed. The message read, "Do not go to that house tonight. I have documents you need to see first. I'm in the parking lot of your building. Please come down now." I read it twice. Then I read it a third time. The earring I just put in suddenly felt very cold against my neck. My uncle had texted me that morning. "Dinner at 7. Your cousin Brianna is making her grandmother's pot roast. It's time we finalized everything, sweetheart. Your father would have wanted this settled before spring. Warm, familiar, the kind of text that makes you feel like family is family no matter what." I had almost believed it. Almost. I set my keys back on the hook. I walked to the elevator without my coat. I didn't need it. I couldn't feel the cold. At all. Marcus was parked in a silver Camry under the amber wash of a parking lot light. He was 61 years old, the kind of man who wore a tie even on Saturdays. And when I climbed into his passenger seat, he looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His briefcase was open on the back seat. Papers everywhere. "Before you say anything," he told me, "I want you to know that I debated calling you for 2 days. I kept telling myself maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was misreading the documents." He shook his head slowly. "I wasn't wrong." He handed me a folder. The first page was a letter on the letterhead of a private psychiatric evaluation clinic in Boulder. It was dated 3 weeks ago. It referenced my name. It referenced a diagnosis that wasn't mine, a history of cognitive instability that had never existed, and at the bottom, a signature from a doctor I had never met, recommending that I be evaluated for a formal competency hearing before I could legally assume control of any significant financial assets. The second page was an email chain between my uncle and a man named Gerald Pruitt, identified in the signature as a probate attorney specializing in contested estates. My hands stopped working correctly. The papers felt strange, too light, like they couldn't possibly be real. Marcus pointed to a line in the third paragraph of the email. I read it twice before it fully landed. Your uncle had retained Pruitt 4 months ago. The strategy was straightforward. My father's estate included a 60% controlling share of Webb Callaway Industrial Supply, the company my grandfather built from nothing, and my father spent his life growing. It was currently valued at just over $11 million. Per the terms of my father's trust, full control transferred to me on my 28th birthday. That was in 19 days. The plan, spelled out in my uncle's own words in a chain of emails he clearly never expected anyone outside that correspondence to read, was to file for a competency hearing the week before my birthday, to use the fabricated psychiatric evaluation to argue I was unfit to manage the inheritance, to have himself appointed as permanent conservator of the estate. Indefinitely. I felt the floor of Marcus's car tilt slightly under my feet. He said quietly, "Your uncle is on the board. He controls the day-to-day operations while the estate is in probate. If a judge rules you incompetent, he doesn't just manage the company temporarily. He takes it. Permanently." I sat with that for a long moment. The parking lot light above us buzzed almost inaudibly. Somewhere out on the street, a car passed with its radio on. I said, "How did you get these?" Marcus paused. Then he said, "Your aunt sent them to me. Diane. She's been photographing documents off his desk for the last 6 weeks. She didn't know what else to do." And just like that, the last 3 years rearranged themselves inside my head like furniture being dragged across a floor in the dark. Every piece finally sliding into the place it had always been meant to occupy. I had just been too disoriented to see the layout. My father died 18 months after his diagnosis, moving fast the way those things sometimes do when the body has already made its decision. He died on a Thursday morning in October, holding my hand, and by Friday afternoon my uncle was at the house with a bottle of wine and a copy of the will and a very gentle, very practiced expression of grief on his face. He loved my father. I had never doubted that. I also had never doubted that he loved the company more. For the 2 years since, I had been what I could only now properly call managed. It started small, a board meeting I was told about after it happened because my uncle wasn't sure I was ready for the operational discussions yet. "Sweetheart, don't worry. I took notes for you." A contract I was supposed to sign that disappeared off my desk for 10 days and reappeared with a different renewal date than I remembered. And when I mentioned it, my uncle sat across from me with that tilted, careful look he'd perfected and said, "Sweetheart, you've been under an enormous amount of stress. Are you sleeping? You look tired. Your father used to get confused when he was tired too." That one sentence did more damage than he probably realized. My father's illness had started with small confusions, small misrememberings. I knew that. My uncle knew I knew that. And so I swallowed it. I started keeping a notepad by my bed to write things down before I forgot them. I started second-guessing my own recollections in meetings. I started arriving 10 minutes early to everything because I was terrified of losing track of time. I thought I was watching myself become my father. I thought I was already halfway gone. I was not gone. I was being erased on purpose, one small confident decision at a time, by a man who needed me to believe I was incapable before I was legally capable of anything. Sitting in Marcus's car with those documents in my lap, I felt something shift in my chest. It was not grief. It was not fear. It was something colder and more precise than either of those things, and it felt a little like the click of a combination lock opening. I looked at Marcus and I said, "I'm going to dinner." He started to object. I held up one hand. I said, "If I don't go, he files the competency petition next week regardless. He has the fake evaluation already. He has the attorney already. If I disappear tonight, he just uses a different door. I need him to use the one I can see." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need?" "I need an hour," I told him. "Then I need you to drive to Cherry Hills and park 2 blocks east of the house and do not come in until I call you." He nodded once. The way people nod when they've decided to trust someone, even though trust feels like standing on ice. I went back upstairs. I did not pace. I did not cry. I made 3 phone calls and I moved through my apartment with the particular stillness that comes when panic has been completely converted into purpose. My therapist once told me I had a gift for compartmentalization. I had spent 2 years thinking she meant it as a gentle criticism. Standing in my kitchen that night, I understood she had been describing armor. The first call was to a 24-hour notary and document service on Larimer Street. They could fit me in at 5:30. I asked them to prepare a sworn affidavit attesting to my mental clarity and legal competency, witnessed and sealed, with a timestamp. They told me to bring a valid ID and 2 forms of secondary identification. I brought 4. The second call was to my cousin Brianna, my uncle's daughter, the one making pot roast. She picked up on the second ring and her voice was already low, already careful, the way voices get when someone is in a room and can't let the wrong person hear the wrong syllable. She said, "I was hoping you'd call." I said, "Is it as bad as I think it is?" She said, "It's worse. There's a man here I've never seen before." Dad introduced him as a family friend, but he keeps looking at his phone and looking at the driveway. And there's a folder on Dad's desk in the study with your name on it. I saw it when I went in to get the phone charger. I said, "Brianna, I need you to do something for me, and I need you to do it in the next 4 minutes before your father comes back downstairs." She didn't hesitate. She said, "Tell me." I said, "Go to the study, take your phone, photograph every page in that folder, then go back to the kitchen and act like you've been there the whole time." 22 seconds of silence. I could hear her breathing. Then she said, "I already knew something was wrong. He's been different since February. Closed off. Moving money between accounts. Mom's been crying." "I know," I told her. "Your mom is actually the reason I know what I know. She's braver than either of us has given her credit for." Another pause. Then, "Okay, I'm going. Don't come before 7. And for God's sake, eat something first. You always make bad decisions when you're hungry." That almost made me laugh. I loved her for it. The third call was the one I had been putting off. It went to voicemail on the first try, and I stood in my kitchen holding the phone, waiting. 30 seconds later, it rang back. The woman on the other end had a voice like a closing argument, clean and unhurried, and she listened to everything I said without interrupting once. When I finished, she said, "I can be outside that address at 7:15. I'll bring a colleague. We won't come in unless you send the signal." I said, "What signal?" She said, "Whatever word you want. Pick something you wouldn't say otherwise." I said, "Settlement." She said, "See you at 7:15. Her name was Patricia Okafor. She was the attorney who had handled my father's estate filings, the one my uncle had quietly edged out of the process 6 months after the funeral by suggesting she was overcomplicating a simple family matter and recommending we consolidate with a single firm. He happened to have a relationship with. Patricia had been waiting for a reason to respond to that ever since. I ate a piece of toast. I put my coat on. I drove to Cherry Hills Village in the February dark, and I have never in my life felt less like a woman on her way to a family dinner, and more like someone walking into a room to collect what belongs to her. My uncle's house sat behind a circular driveway bordered by bare oak trees that in summer were beautiful, and in February looked like they were holding their breath. The porch light was on. Through the front window, I could see the warm blur of the dining room chandelier. Very welcoming. Very rehearsed. He opened the door before I reached the steps. He was wearing the burgundy sweater he'd had for at least a decade, the one my father used to tease him about, and he pulled me into a hug that was a fraction too tight and lasted a fraction too long. He said, "Sweetheart, you made it. I was worried about you driving in this weather." I said, "The roads were fine." I stepped inside. The house smelled like pot roast and wood smoke and expensive candle wax. Brianna was in the kitchen, and she came around the corner wiping her hands on a dish towel, and when our eyes met, something passed between us that we have never needed words for. She gave me a small nod. One small nod. I understood what it meant. My Aunt Diane came out of the living room. She was a slight woman with silver-streaked hair and careful hands, and when she hugged me, she held on for just a moment longer than usual, and I felt her exhale against my shoulder like she'd been holding that breath for 6 weeks. "I love you," she said, very quietly, into the hug. "I know," I whispered back. "Me too." The dining room table was set for 5. My uncle guided me to the chair at the far end, away from the door and facing the large window that looked out onto the backyard. "Seat of honor," he said. "Your father always sat there." I noticed the chair did not have a clear line of sight to the hallway or the front entry. I noticed this the way you notice things when you have stopped being a guest and started being a witness. The 5th person at the table was introduced as Dr. Franklin Morse, an old colleague of my uncle's from the Denver Athletic Club. He was perhaps 60, with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to performing competence in rooms where competence is currency. He stood to shake my hand, and the way he looked at me slowly, clinically, cataloging told me everything Marcus had already confirmed in print. Dr. Morse was not a dinner guest. Dr. Morse was an evaluation. I smiled at him the way I smile at auditors. We sat. Brianna served. My uncle poured wine from a crystal decanter already waiting on the sideboard, and I watched his hands as he filled my glass first, generous and deliberate, and set it directly in front of me. He said, "It's a Napa cab. Your father's label. We should have it on a night like this." My father did love that wine. My uncle knew that. He also knew I would have an emotional response to the mention of it, which would make me look exactly like what the fabricated evaluation needed me to look like. Unsteady, sentimental, easily overwhelmed. I looked at the glass. The wine was deep red in the candlelight and it smelled exactly right. I had not touched the decanter. Neither had anyone else at the table, because Brianna had gotten there first. She had texted me at 6:48. Done. Also the wine. I used the apple cider vinegar from the pantry because it was the same color, and you deserve to watch him watch you drink that. I lifted the glass. I let it catch the light. I said, "To family." My uncle smiled his oldest smile. "To family," he echoed. I drank. What followed was perhaps the most elaborate piece of theater I have ever participated in. Dinner proceeded. My uncle steered the conversation with the precision of a man who had rehearsed it, touching gently on the estate proceedings, the complexity of the paperwork, how much he worried about me carrying so much alone, how my father had always said she's brilliant but she takes on too much. She burns herself out. Doctor. Morse asked me questions that sounded like small talk, and were not. How was my sleep? Had I been keeping up with my routine? Had I been feeling scattered lately? I answered every question with a soft, slightly unfocused affect I had been perfecting for the last 90 minutes. I stirred my food more than I ate it. I touched my temple once, as if locating a thought that had drifted. I said, "I'm sorry, what was that?" to a question I had heard perfectly clearly. My uncle's face did the thing I had been waiting for it to do. Just for a half second, less than a breath, the concern dropped, and something satisfied moved behind his eyes like a fish moving under ice. Then it was gone, and the concern was back, and he was reaching across the table to touch my hand. He said, "Sweetheart, this is actually something we wanted to talk to you about tonight. Dr. Morse has some concerns. And I think, out of love, out of what I owe your father, we need to have an honest conversation about whether you're really in a position to take on the responsibilities of the estate right now." I said quietly, "What kind of concerns?" Dr. Morse leaned forward. "The kind that come from caring about your long-term well-being," he said. "Nothing alarmist. Just a recommendation for a thorough evaluation before we move forward with any major financial transfers." I looked at the table. I let the silence stretch. I let him believe it was confusion, or fear, or the early stages of capitulation. Then I reached into my bag. I placed the notarized affidavit on the table between the water glasses. The gold-embossed seal caught the candlelight. I said, I had an independent psychiatric and cognitive competency evaluation completed this evening at 5:45. Board-certified clinician, third-party facility, full toxicology panel. I have been declared fully competent, legally oriented, and fit to manage all personal and fiduciary responsibilities. The timestamp is there at the bottom. The room went very still. My uncle looked at the document. His expression did not change, but his hand, the one still resting near mine, on the tablecloth, withdrew. Dr. Moore said, That's not quite how this process works. A single evaluation doesn't. I said, You're absolutely right. Which is why I've also filed a formal complaint with the Colorado Medical Board regarding the evaluation that was prepared about me by a physician I have never met, in a facility I have never visited, for a condition I have never been diagnosed with. I have a copy of that complaint here as well. I have a copy of the letter authorizing it. And I have, on my phone right now, a recorded conversation with Gerald Pruitt's paralegal who, it turns out, was not aware that the subject of the competency filing had been provided with documentation of the conspiracy in advance. People get very forthcoming when they realize they're potentially listed as a co-conspirator. That last part was a slight exaggeration, but only slight. Brianna quietly got up from the table and went to stand near the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. My Aunt Diane had not moved. She was looking at her husband across the table with an expression I recognized because I had felt it myself 2 hours ago in the parking lot of my apartment building. The expression of someone watching the architecture of a lie finally come down. My uncle said, This is a misunderstanding. I was trying to protect you. Your father asked me. My father, I said, asked you to execute his estate faithfully and transparently. I have reviewed every decision you have made in that capacity over the last 18 months with my attorney and my CPA. I have documentation of 3 instances of unauthorized transfer of company operating funds into personal accounts, 2 instances of contract alteration without my written consent as a named beneficiary, and a retained agreement with a probate attorney that constitutes a direct conflict of interest given your fiduciary role. My attorney is outside right now. She has copies of everything. I said the word. I said, I think it's time for a settlement. Within 4 minutes, Patricia Okafor came through the front door with her colleague, a junior attorney named Davis, who had the very specific energy of someone who had been told this evening might get interesting and had been looking forward to it. Dr. Morse said he needed to use the restroom. He did not return. My uncle sat at the head of his own dinner table while Patricia laid documents in front of him with the quiet efficiency of someone who has been waiting a long time to do exactly this. Brianna stood in the kitchen doorway. My Aunt Diane poured herself a glass of the apple cider vinegar wine, looked at it, and then pushed it away. She looked at me across the table and gave me a small, exhausted, grateful smile that I will probably carry for the rest of my life. The investigation took 4 months. The Colorado Securities Division was involved before the end of the first month. Gerald Pruitt surrendered his law license in lieu of criminal prosecution in exchange for full cooperation, which produced enough documentation to make my uncle's position legally indefensible. Dr. Morse lost his medical license in a separate proceeding. The fabricated psychiatric evaluation was formally struck from the record. My uncle did not go to prison. His attorney negotiated a settlement that required him to repay the transferred funds with interest, resign from the company board permanently, and submit to a 5-year period of financial monitoring by a court-appointed officer. Whether that was enough justice is a question I have stopped trying to answer. I've learned that justice and closure are not always the same weight, and you can have one without the other and still find a way to breathe. I turned 28 on a Tuesday in late February. Marcus Webb called at 7 in the morning to confirm that the trust transfer had been finalized, that the controlling shares were in my name, and that the first board meeting under my chairmanship had been scheduled for the following Monday. He said it in the voice of a man who had been waiting to make that phone call for a long time. Brianna drove up from Cherry Hills 2 days later with a cake she'd made from scratch and absolutely no apology for the fact that it was lopsided. We ate it at my kitchen table and didn't talk about any of it for almost an hour. We talked about her daughter, who had just started walking. We talked about my father, the good things, the way he laughed with his whole face, the way he called us both kid until we were old enough to object and then kept doing it anyway. We talked about her mother, who had filed for divorce the week after that dinner and was already, by her own account, sleeping better than she had in 6 years. At some point, Brianna said, Do you think he thought you'd just let it happen? I thought about it. I said, I think he thought he'd already made sure of it. She nodded. We ate more cake. Here is what I have learned. And I want to say it plainly because I think some of you have your own version of that dinner waiting for you somewhere on the calendar. When someone works very hard to convince you that your own mind cannot be trusted, the thing they are most afraid of is the moment you discover they were wrong. That fear is information. That fear is a map. It tells you exactly where the power is and exactly who has decided you're not supposed to have access to it. I was not confused. I was not unstable. I was not incapable of managing what my father built and left to me. I was a woman who had been systematically taught to doubt the evidence of her own competence by a person who needed her incompetent in order to survive. There is a name for that. There are several names for it. The most useful one is over. My father worked for 31 years to build something worth leaving behind. He left it to me because he believed I was the right person to carry it forward. He was not confused about that either. The company had its strongest revenue quarter in 6 years this past spring. My CFO, who is extraordinary and has been with the firm for 11 years and was very nearly driven out by my uncle 18 months ago, sent me a one-line email with the numbers and a single exclamation point at the end. I read it standing in the parking lot after a board meeting on a Thursday afternoon in April, with the mountains visible over the roofline and the kind of cold, bright Colorado sky that makes you feel like everything has been washed clean. I stood there for a moment, just stood there. Then I walked back inside, because there was work to do, and I was exactly the right person to do it.